in North Austin, you saw a consistent sort of spread between sales prices. Here in East Austin, you really have sort of, it remains fixed, and then you see the spread sort of resulting. Yes?
Is it the case that each of these lines is the forecast, the fitted value forecast
yes.
from a hedonic price regression, where what you're changing here is the dependent variable?
No, so essentially what I'm doing is I'm holding all the, I'm using a linear combination to
right,
sort of construct the same house.
3 different linear combinations.
Yes, yes. And all what I'm changing is instead of the sale price, I just put in the original list price.
And then you redid the regression.
And then I redid the regression.
And then you do your linear combination for the median house.
Yes, exactly. So we're tracking the same house over and over and over again. So using this approach, I did it for the rest of Austin and to see if like you could construct an index for the whole city. And basically what I did is I created a price level for each one of these zones, and then I scaled up the results according to the percentage of the transactions that that zone was responsible for. And this is what came out. So what you can see sort of like the trend is sort of repeating itself, where you have sort of like a housing peak, then you have a recession, and then you have a recovery, and then really you see the general Austin price level beginning to decline again. And really, as you can see, sort of you have sort of this scenario situation right here, where you actually have sort of a bidding up of price levels. So really what's sort of happening, at least throughout most of Austin, is that people are listing their house and then they're actually raising the list price over time, which is what you're seeing across many neighborhoods. So that's kind of one interesting thing that's happening. Yes?
Are the neighborhood weights, the weights given to different neighborhoods in creating that general index, or those fixed,
yes.
or those change depending on?
No, so I kept the weights the same from when I constructed the whole index. So there are some limitations to this approach. So probably the biggest one is that while I was looking at zones that were economically and geographically sort of similar, you still haven't completely controlled for location. You know, you have positive and negative externalities within the neighborhood. Like I say, you have definitely views, you know, you have shopping centers, you have a lot of different things that wouldn't be captured just by looking at the neighborhood zone. Another limitation is that you do have an element of selection bias when you're using the hedonic approach. All the houses that are sold by owner, as opposed to going through the MLS network, those are not going to be picked up in this kind of index. So you either have to manually enter them in, or you just have to accept that there's going to be some kind of negative bias in the results. The other sort of, this is probably going to be like one of the biggest shortcomings of this approach, is that you are going to have a compositional bias. So the categories that I was regressing on, they're very broad. Like the number of bedrooms, the number of baths. Well, within those categories, you could have sort of a demand shift towards a particular kind of house. So it could just so happen that in a given neighborhood, houses that had really good views of the lake or that had really open floor plans could be selling better than the average house in the neighborhood. So in that sense, you could have sort of, within the neighborhood, you could have a demand shift, and that would be picked up as the entire neighborhood doing better. You also have stratification, and this is actually something that came up in East Austin a lot, where you have very poor neighborhoods right next to a lot of gentrification activity. And so that would sort of bias the results as well, because when you're aggregating everything, sort of like the gentrification neighborhoods, those will pull up the value of the index, and that could possibly not be very representative of the entire neighborhood itself. So those are some weaknesses you would definitely have to control for if you were to adapt this. So to conclude, the number one reaction that I get from people is, how could I use sort of this approach to sell my house without a realtor? You could do this if you had the data. What you could do is you could construct a hedonic index for your own house if you're thinking about selling it. And then what you could do is you could sort of figure out, you know, what's the general trend. So this is kind of like, you know, T minus 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. And you could sort of get an idea of where you should list your price. So you could sort of maximize your bargaining range, but not price yourself out of the market. So in that sense, you could create like a consulting company, or if your realtor was nice enough, he could give you this data, and you could just construct it yourself using this data. But this is sort of one general application of this approach. On a more general level, you could create like a macroeconomic indicator of the entire region. So you could just use this index, and you could say, okay, you could in a sense sort of figure out what's happened to the general housing stock based on all the transactions that are happening in all the different neighborhoods. But this seems to be the most practical approach, the practical use of this approach, to sort of figure out what you should list your house for. So that concludes my presentation. Any questions?
On the website.
So,
Let people run it themselves.
so there aren't any representatives from the Board of Realtors here. Okay. So they would be extremely unpleased because essentially, like, probably the second reason that realtors exist is because they know the market. And so if I were to like create a website and I were to publish this, they would very quickly find out a way to shut it down, probably.
So, you promise them on the
Well, the problem is that it's their proprietary data. So I'm a member of the Board of Realtors.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So that's the only way that I can access this data set. And so kind of like as a condition of getting that data, what they say is like you cannot use this in any way to like kind of sell. You can't really sell this, you know, you can't sell this index to anybody or even put it on a public website. So that's kind of one drawback. So, yes.
You use this to index prices in particular, but can you also use it to try and graph trends in what people's particular preferences are? So if you look through the data and find all the different information, can you say like improved kitchens are obviously what people are more wanting, and thus trying to figure out from a consumer and salesman point what house they should buy right now?
That actually was the original question of my thesis, where I was trying to figure out like how does the value of particular attributes change over time. What I sort of ended up sort of figuring out is that people were more concerned about sort of like what's the value of the whole house when you put it together. But you could certainly, like, when I was running a lot of these regressions, so if you go back to the very beginning, so what you could do is you could track each one of these coefficients over time, and you could see how they change. And so, surprisingly, it's like it always depends, you know, on which neighborhood you're looking at, but you could definitely sort of create like a sort of what's the value of adding a bedroom to my house, for instance? How could that change? You could definitely use that as well. So I saw another question. Yes.
So did you see that your time trend for the median sales was comparable to other indexes?
So thanks for asking that. So apparently with Austin in particular, because there is no Case-Shiller for Austin, really the only kind of base that you have to compare with is just the median sales price. And really the median sales price almost stayed completely flat during the recession. And so in that sense, it wasn't very helpful because the few houses that were selling during the recession, for some reason, like they just weren't very representative of what was going on. So that was kind of like my base. The other sort of comparison base that you could have used was looking at like just appraised values. But I say the appraised values are very misleading, like for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that it's just you're using very antiquated, outdated data to reach that price level.
Great. Now Andrew's going to be the discussant for one.
All right. I guess when I was Juan's first discussant, he gave me a giant packet of just raw state output and data on the houses, and that was a little intimidating at first, just the amount of data that I saw that you had to go through. But you know, after seeing his presentation, I was really impressed. And I think the base thing is I just saw a couple avenues for further research I'd like to see. I mean, I realize, you know, with the time constraints, and obviously the data constraints as you were talking about with the Board of Realtors, but I'd really like to see how this compared to other cities and how they fared in the recession. You know, maybe across the country and see how real estate markets reacted across the place, or maybe in a city that did have a Case-Shiller index, if you could construct a hedonic reduction and see how those two compared, I guess. And I think, yeah, you also, your data came up with some interesting questions, and I guess I would like to see how, you said there was a gap between the final list price in North Austin that seemed to be much larger than in East Austin. And considering that it's, I guess North Austin's a little bit more economically higher up than East Austin, I would like to also see the data compared to like Westlake. Is that gap existent in a place like Westlake that is a little bit more affluent? And does that correspond to, or would that be a reason possibly for the larger list price? There we go. I see, yeah.
So you can see with Westlake where they're starting out at, about 600,000. So it's an interesting neighborhood to look at.
Well, great job, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now for Lily Bow, A Tale of Two Crises, the effect of the Great